So good evening, everyone. We are studying Tractate Makkot. We are in the last stretch of the first chapter on page 7a. We learned the Mishnah last time, and the Mishnah is talking about two cases when the convict who was about to be executed ran away from court. So the first case is that the verdict came down that the person is convicted and he needs to be executed, is condemned, and he ran away. And then somehow he was caught and was brought in front of the same court. So the Mishnah is saying that the court can rely on the previous conviction and does not need to reopen the case, and basically can execute him on the spot. So that is one case. The other case is that two people are coming to a court and testifying that so-and-so was in another court in another city, and he was condemned over there, and two witnesses, and they're specifying which witnesses came, and basically testified against him, and he was convicted. So that is also someone that the second court in the other city that didn't even hear the case. They just heard from witnesses that they heard the case. They can convict. They can basically execute the convict based on their testimony. So those are the two cases. So the Gemara now is comparing those two cases and saying that based on those two cases, it seems that we have a conflict, because according to one case, the first case, what do we say in the first case? That if someone ran away from a court and later was brought to the same court, they can rely on the conviction, right, and execute him. From the fact that the Mishnah is very, very exact and saying that the person was brought in front of the same court, that's when they can rely on the conviction. What does it mean? It means that if it comes to a second court, to another court, he was convicted in New York, and then he was brought into a court in Philadelphia. So then the court starts over and hearing all of the testimony all over again, all of the case all over again. That's what it seems, right? Otherwise, the Mishnah would not be so exact in saying that if they brought it in front of the same court, they would say we brought it in any court, right? The fact that they say brought it in front of the same court, it means that only the same court can rely on the first conviction, not another court. But that does not sound like the second case. The second case is specifically saying a different thing, that if another court has got a whiff of the fact that a certain person was convicted, and they have credible witnesses that were present in the first conviction, they don't restart the whole court case. They basically can take their word and execute the person. So which way is it? You know, that's the question that the Gemara is posing. Let's read it inside. לפני אותו בית דין ודין סותרים. לפני בית דין אחר סותרים. In front of the same court from the first case, we see that in front of the same court, you don't restart the case, but in front of another court, you do. But at the end, Hatani Seifa, the second section of the Mishnah, saying, כל מקום שיעמדו שניים ויאמרו מעידים אנו את איש פלוני שנגמר דינו בבית דין פלוני ופלוני פלוני העדה והרי זה נהרג. The second case is stating exactly the opposite, that if you come in front of a second court and the second court has enough witnesses, enough they can rely on the story that the conviction occurred, they take their word and they don't restart the case. So which way is it? That is the question. So Amar Abaye lo kashya, kan be'eretz Yisrael, kan bechutz la'aretz. Wow, that is the answer that Abaye gives. Let's dig into it and understand exactly what he's saying. The saying is that Eretz Yisrael has a special air, and therefore has a special kedusha, have a special something there that when we live in our country, our faculties are functioning better. Okay, and also there is holiness in Eretz Yisrael, and the holiness is affecting the inhabitants of Eretz of the land, including the court system. So what we're saying is as follows: that a court in the land of Israel has a better chance of finding a merit on how in the person, of finding a way not to convict the person, because they have a lot of support, spiritual support. And a court outside of Israel, they function the way they function, and a second court does not have any more merit than the first court. So how does it go? So what are we saying here? So what we're saying here is as follows: the first statement of the Mishnah has to be read as follows: that the conviction to death happened outside of the land of Israel. Happened in America, okay? Outside of the land of Israel, and the person was convicted and then ran away. He ran away to Eretz Israel, and then he was brought in front of the court in Eretz Israel, and so if it's the same judges, meaning the judges also made aliyah in the meanwhile. So in the year 2000, a certain person was standing in front of a Beis Din in New York and was convicted to death. Okay, and then he ran away and went to Eretz Israel, and the judges also 2 years later went to Eretz Israel. Comes 2023, and both the judges and the convict meet in Eretz Israel somehow. He is being brought in front of them to, he was for that original crime. So because it's the same people, you don't say that the same people will be able to find, they looked at it already. They're not going to find something else. So therefore you don't start the court case. However, if he's being brought in front of another court, another set of judges, the original set of judges is still sitting in New York, but a new set of judges he's being brought in front of, so then we have to give that court, the Israeli court, the opportunity to find a merit, to find a way on how to acquit the condemned convict. So that is what the first case of the Mishnah is saying. The second case of the Mishnah is saying that the person is being brought in front of a court outside of Israel. The first court happened, whether it happens in Israel or outside of Israel, it doesn't matter. But because when they're being brought the second time, they're being brought outside of Israel, there is no merit of the land. There is no spirituality that will be backing up those judges. So they right away say, we're gonna rely on everything, on whatever happened before. We're not any smarter than the previous guys. So therefore, they rely on the original conviction. So that's the difference between courts in Israel and courts in the outside of Israel. Any questions? All right. Now, Abaye is bringing support from a Braita, the Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda ben Dostai Omer. He says, in the name of Rab Shimon ben Shatach, Mi shebarach me'eretz ישראל לחוץ לארץ, אין סותרים מדינו. מחוץ לארץ ישראל סותרים מדינו מפני שחוצה של ארץ ישראל. שמעון בן שטח was a very lived in a very interesting time. Shimon ben Shattach, his sister was a queen. Shlom Tzion HaMalka was his sister. Okay? And he lived at the time that there was fierce fights between the Orthodox and the Reform. Tzdukim and Pushim, they called them then, but it's basically Orthodox and Reform. They had fierce fights in between them. And at that time, when he was around, the Reform were running the country. The king was a Reform king, was a Tzduki, and all of his, all of the upper echelon was such. Now, what happens is that a lot of people had to run away because he decided to clear the land from all the rabbis. That's the easiest way to win an argument. It's, some sides nowadays use the same method. Instead of actually arguing on a marriage, it's just beat up or kill the other side, and that's it. That's they win the argument. So the king was killing all the rabbis. So a lot of rabbis were running away. So you had very common situations where courts were running away, where convicts were running away, and then the meeting later, years later when the king died, and then his wife became a queen because she was the sister of Shimon ben Shattach, who was obviously a tzaddik, was the leader, the Orthodox leader of the Jewish people at the time. So she brought in back a lot of the Pushim, a lot of the Orthodox to power. So it was a very common situation where courts were displaced outside of Israel, back to inside of Israel. He himself ended up running to Egypt for his life and then came back. I mean, it's a story. So no wonder he was weighing in on this kind of case or these kind of cases. And it's very common that the life of the rabbis and the era in which they lived in affected very much what halachic questions they were dealing with. So this is Shimon ben Shattach was saying that basically what we just mentioned before. All right, next. Okay, we were mentioning the fact that there is a precondition in order to judge capital cases. We need to have a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, in Bet HaMikdash, sitting in Supreme Court, sitting, and judging over there. And then there is the opportunity, or there is the permission for other courts in other places to judge capital cases. However, if the court is not, the courts are not, the Supreme Court is displaced, even if it's right outside of the city of Yerushalayim, they're right there, the 5-minute drive from there. You don't deal capital punishments. Okay, so the question is, where do we get it from? How do we know that this is the case? That you need that you need to have that court in Israel, that it matters the court in Israel. Number one. Number two, how do we know that you allowed altogether to have capital cases heard in other courts, even outside of Israel? It seems that it shouldn't, maybe, because capital cases should be heard by Supreme Court in Yerushalayim. Why do we know? So it says that there are two verses, one in Bamidbar and one in Dvarim, that's talking about the judges and the capital cases. The first one, it says, right after we mentioning the laws of judges and capital cases, it says, that those laws that we just mentioned about sitting in courts and judging capital cases, they're going to be forever, לדורותיכם, for generations to come, בכל מושבותיכם, wherever you dwell, wherever you live, anywhere on earth, anywhere that you have a community and there is a court, Jewish court, they can judge those things. So that's one So from here למדנו לסנהדרין שנוהגת בארץ ובחוץ לארץ. So that's how we learn that Sanhedrin is functional inside Eretz Israel and outside Eretz Israel. So now let's contrast with that the second verse from Dvarim, and let's see what that teaches us. Im ken ma Talmud lomar. So what are we learning from the second verse that says Bisharecha? What is Bisharecha? There is in Parashat Shoftim, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol she'arecha, that God is the whole book of Deuteronomy is basically a set of instructions to the Jewish people. What are we supposed to do when we set up shop in Israel? Once we enter the land of Israel, it was told the whole Chumash, the whole book was told to us by Moshe on the last month of his life, I think, and it was one second. It was. I'm sorry, I just got distracted here. So the whole book was telling us instructions what to do when we get to the land of Israel, and one of the first parshiot that deals with it is stating that we need to set up a court system. We need to set up a court system, and we have to set up both police and courts. And we need to do it b'chol sharecha, in all of our cities, gates, right? Sharecha is gates. So we need to do it in all of our cities, but where? The one that Hashem Elokecha noten lach, that God gives us, meaning only in the land of Israel. Okay? V'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. So on the one hand, we see that we are allowed and we should have courts in Israel and outside of Israel. And here we're saying that the whole system should be built in Israel. So how do you figure? So it says, the Gemara is teaching us that there is one word difference between the first verse and the second verse. And that is the word sharecha. Sharecha means your gates. Okay? So he's teaching us that in the land of Israel, we have the obligation to set up a court system in every region and in every city. Why do we need in every region and in every city? Because every district, because cities may have disputes, okay? About land, about trade, about, cities have disputes from time to time. So we need a district court system in order to judge the disputes between cities. However, outside of the land of Israel, we don't have this problem because we're not ruling. It's not our land. So, the cities are being run by the people, by the natives. They're not being run by a Jewish court. So therefore, outside of the land of Israel, we just need district courts. So multiple cities will have access to a court system, a Jewish court system outside of Israel. So this is how we learn from those two verses the different types of court systems that we have. Basically, in Israel, we need a court in every city and a district court system, and outside of Israel, only a district court system. All right? Next. Sanhedrin Oreget. We were talking about, because we were mentioning Sanhedrin and what they do and how they do it, we mentioned the fact that a Sanhedrin, that a court that executes once in every 7 years, is characterized as a destructive tribunal. Those are people that have a short, very easy finger on the gun, on the trigger. So they're destructive because it's our job to it's a job of a court, not a job of a court to find ways to not convict someone. Okay, not convict someone to die. So and when we mentioned that opinion, so listen to the words. It says that a court that judges, that executes once in every 7 years, is characterized as destructive tribunal. That's the translation of the Hebrew verse. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah is saying only once in 70 years. He didn't say that once in 7 years is what? He just meant once in 7 years, like he's answering. Now what is he saying? Is he saying that once in 7 years, that his opinion is that it's even a court that kills once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal? That's one way of hearing it. Another way of listening it says, no, that he's not saying that that's a destructive. So 1 in 70 years is okay. Meaning, once in 7 years, that's a normal course of business. I mean, those laws are on the books because they're being used. So once in 70 years, you use the electric chair. It's good. The stoning, whatever it is that it was, it's normal. So what is he saying? Is he discouraging even 1 in 70 years not to do it, or he's saying that 1 in 70 years is okay? Teku, the question, the dilemma shall stand until Mashiach comes and tell us we don't know. Now, because we were talking about destructive tribunals, so Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, and again, let's just take a step back and understand when these gentlemen, in what era they lived, because it really is painting the way they think about things. So Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva lived in the land of Israel during the destruction of the first temple, second temple, the destruction of the second temple of Bet HaMikdash Hasheni. So and that didn't happen, with an atomic bomb that happened. Boom, everything was hunky dory, and then it just fell and was destroyed. There was a deterioration that took hundreds of years of the land, of the order in the land. We were 200 years before that. It was the story of Hanukkah happened. We were conquered by the Greeks, and then they left and didn't leave all the way. And there were Romans afterwards that came to bother us. In between, there was the Assyrians that came to. I mean, there were a lot of the land was not really under one Jewish rule. That like in the time of David HaMelech or Shlomo, it was far from it. And when you have you had a lot of different jurisdictions and a lot of governors, and it was not uniformly governed, and therefore that obviously chaos ensued. That makes sure this kind of governing system makes sure that you have a lot of different opinions and a lot of different people doing whatever they want, and so you had a lot of murderers. Okay, and 40. It says, we mentioned last time that 40 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the court system moved out of Yerushalayim in order to not judge capital cases. So the Supreme Court building was abandoned, and the Beit HaMikdash was still there, was functioning, but that section was not in use, and the Supreme Court convened right outside of Beit HaMikdash, or right outside of Yerushalayim. So at the time of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, that's where they were born into that time, and so they didn't really see the Supreme Court sitting on a court case, on a capital punishment court case. So and they understood why, and they were very much in support of this kind of a move to take. They were part of the Supreme Court that was dislocated, relocated outside of Beit HaMikdash. So they said that if they would be in charge, they would never execute anyone. They would find a way not to execute anyone. So the Gemara is asking, this is a very nice statement, how would you do it? So Hachi Avu Avdei, what trick would you use to get people off the hook? So we're starting with the most obvious choice, which is a murder case. Okay, somebody was murdered. The murderer has to be executed. So how do you get a murderer of death row? So it says, דאמרי טרפאיו, ראיתם טרפה, הרג, שלם הרג. So what is trefa? Okay, treif. Do you know what treif is? What do you use treif for? What do you use treif for? Curious to know. What would you call treif? Marty. Moshe. You muted. What?
Yeah. Any animal that is not going to live for a year.
Any animal?
From or disease.
An animal that was not shecht properly. A kosher animal that was not shecht properly, right? That died in a... What?
Died or is going to, or has a broken bone or something that
beautiful.
Invalidate its life.
Beautiful. So treif really is a medical condition of a living animal. Treif is not just a dead animal. Okay? So if an animal has some sort of a damage that will cause the animal to die within 12 months, that animal is called treif. All right? Even though it's walking and it's happy and it's pasturing, but they have some sort of a condition that, with this condition, 6 months, 8 months, they're done. They're dead. So that's called a treif, a trefa. The same rule applies to human beings. You have someone who has a medical problem, and the medical problem is so severe, and you have one of 18 medical problems, and that medical problem is so severe that the person will not survive 12 months, will not live for 12 months. So that person is called treif, because treif is not just an animal that you eat, it's also someone, it's a medical condition that applies to humans. All right, so what happens if someone is treif? A human being happens to be, I don't know, they have a problem in their heart, they have a problem in their brain, they have a problem in an internal organ that will, a hole in their lungs. I mean, there are several of those. It's 18 different conditions that the Gemara is listing, or the Mishnah is listing in Chulin. So if someone kills that person during that 12 months before they die on their own, that person is not considered a murder. He is not getting punished like a murderer that killed a healthy person, because he basically killed a dead man walking. And if it's a dead man walking, so it's not. He can say that had I done the same thing to someone who's very healthy or normal, they wouldn't have died, and I didn't think that they would die from this poke. It's not. It shouldn't kill such a thing. And this guy died because he was treif, because he had a medical condition. So what Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Akiva are saying, that Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, what would they do when they had two witnesses showing up in court and says that Mr. So-and-so is a murderer because he killed someone? So they're asking the witnesses, did you check the wound? Did you examine? Did you do a forensic examination on the wound to see that the wound was not there before, that there was no internal wound before that? So if let's say a person was stabbed in the stomach, right, with a sword, did you check that? Did you take the person apart? Did you do a forensic examination? How do you know that there was no hole in their lung before, or in their stomach before, inside, internal bleeding? How would you know that the person wasn't treif? And therefore, if the person would have been treif, that murderer is not going to die. He's not going to go scot-free, but he's not going to die. So, because these kind of questions would be asked by Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, once they are, if you don't ask them, you shouldn't consider such far off case. But if the question was asked in court and the witnesses are not coming with a good solution, with a good answer, because most witnesses would not go and examine the body, they would run away or whatever. So they would go scot-free because they didn't have a good answer. So this is what Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar says. This is how Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva would get people off death row, of being convicted, had the opportunity presented itself to them, which it didn't. But had it been, that's how they would take them off the case. So Rav Ashi says that's very good answer for a capital punishment case that has to do with murder. Amar Rav Ashi, im timtze lomar shalem ava dil. Oh no, I'm sorry. So he continues to explain. So if you say shalem ava dilma bimkom saif nekev ava, so it says if the witnesses will say yes, we knew that we examined the body, and the person did not have any other blemish, any other problem except the sword was stuck in him that the murderer killed, right? So then Rav Ashi says Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon would come with another question. Yeah, but how do you know that there was no hole there before? Maybe there was a hole already and the sword went in a pre-existing hole, and that's where the treif was. That's where the medical condition was. So, and for this kind of thing, you really needed expert, examination, which most witnesses are not qualified to do. So that's how they would get him off the case. Okay? So that's how Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon would get a murderer off the case by asking these kind of questions to witnesses. However, there are other issues, because you have capital punishments not only for murders. You have in general 4 major classifications of laws that has to do with capital punishment. The first one is what we discussed as a murder case. A second one is avodah zarah, someone who's idol worshipping. The laws of idol worship are so exact and so complicated that rarely, if ever, not ever, I mean people did, but rarely can people be convicted to be killed for avodah zarah. So that's, everybody understand that it's very easy to get off the hook for that. The same thing, a third classification is Shabbat, Hilchot Shabbat, which we all Shomer Shabbos, but you have a lot of strict rules, and it's very, it's unfortunately easy to trip. So Hilchot Shabbat are also very complicated, and they need to be done. Someone needs to do a Mechal Shabbos in a very specific way, and has to be warned in a very specific way. It's not common to kill someone on Shabbos. I think the only time that it was really done was what's mentioned, the father of Bnot Tzlofchad in the desert. I don't think they actually found someone and executed him for Shabbos in later years. I think actually there are a couple of stories, but not many. So we understand why that is easy to get off the hook. But there is another problem, and that is all of the laws of forbidden intercourse. That is rampant. Was rampant then, is rampant now, and people are having a sexual relationship with spouses that they should not, with people that they should not be together with. So how would Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon would get someone who off the hook on something like that? If 2 witnesses are coming and say, listen, Mr. So-and-so slept with his sister. Okay? We saw them. So what would you say to the witnesses? How would you trip the witnesses in order to get the person off death row? So Abaye and Rava, the Amret Reva, they both and you say, did you actually see the act? Did you actually see the thing go in there, or did you actually see it all the way? And most witnesses they're not that close to see, and they're not examining that. They saw someone, hugging, kissing, they maybe saw them naked in bed, but they didn't see the actual act, or they didn't see all the way the act because it was covered up, whatever. So that's how you can get them off the hook. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. That's how they would get these kind of cases not to end up in death row. However, Rabbanan disagree with them, and they say, no, we wouldn't do something like that because the Mishnah is saying that we will lose the entire deterrence, right? We will lose the deterrence. People will just do whatever they want if nobody is going to be punished for it. So how would they be able to find witnesses that actually saw the actual act? How that's rare that somebody sees the actual act of two people who are not allowed to be together. So how would you get it done anyway? So he says that the rabbis are of a different opinion. They're of the opinion of Shmuel. And Shmuel is very lenient, and he's saying you don't actually need to see the thing going into the other thing, You have to they have to be together, and they have to be, the adulterers have to look like they're doing it, and that's good enough. You don't have to actually needs to have evidence on video to see exactly the thing. So that's what the rabbis are saying, and that's why they would try to convict someone in that case. Hadran alach ketzat ha'edim. So we are finished the first chapter out of 4, out of 3. First chapter out of 3 of Masechet Makkot, and onward we're going to go to the next chapter. Now, the next chapter needs a little bit of an introduction. Any question, before we jump into the next chapter, any question on what we discussed? Okay. All right. The second chapter is talking about cities of refuge. Okay? It's the cities of refuge were used to levy a punishment of an exile on someone. On someone who killed not on purpose, by mistake, b'shogeg. Now, they are just like in civil court, that you have 1 degree, murder for the 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree, manslaughter. You have different levels of these kind of punishments. The same thing exists in Jewish law. So you have someone who killed on purpose. Someone who killed on purpose, they have to be executed. The courts, if you have 2 credible witnesses, and they warn the person, the murderer, before, and that he will be executed if he does it, and he does it anyway, on purpose, the person is being killed. That's the simple case. Then you have someone who killed not on purpose. And so in that case, you have a lot of different shades to it and a lot of different details. And sometimes the Torah is obligating the person to run to a refuge city. And sometimes the relative of the victim, of the person who was murdered, are either obligated or they're allowed to retaliate and kill the murderer, okay, if he is outside of that city. So in this chapter, we are discussing basically 3 levels of killing not on purpose. The first level is called shogeg. Shogeg means someone who it has a little bit of culpability. It's I would think it's like something like manslaughter nowadays. A person didn't mean to, but they have some negligence. There is some negligence. It's not gross negligence. It's not they did something totally crazy, start shooting in a mall and expecting nobody to die, but it's a gross negligence. It's not gross, it's negligence. So for something like that, this is the case that the Torah is obligating the murderer to run to a refuge city. Okay? And also the Torah is allowing one of the relatives to retaliate and kill the murderer on account of their loss. So if the murderer did not go to a refuge city, if they do go to a refuge city, they're not allowed to kill. So that's case number one. Case number two is duress. Okay, someone who killed and they totally had no control over it. For example, every day in a building, somebody goes into an elevator and goes down and go to work. Okay, and one morning somehow there was a worker down on the bottom of the elevator shaft, and the person took the elevator and crushed that other guy to death. They had absolutely no way of knowing and no idea and no control over it. It just happens. The elevator came down, the guy died, and the person pressed the button. That's honest. So this person gets scot-free. Basically, the relative is not allowed to kill him, and the murderer is not obligated to run away to exile. And then there is an in-between case, another case, not in between, another case called karov lemezid. It's someone which is negligence, almost gross negligence, almost mazid. It's like he was really should have done. He should have known. Someone who's driving back a truck in the middle of a big city and decided to back up without checking. I mean, someone who's really gross negligence. You should have known, you silly. It's so a person like that, because it's almost on purpose. It's not, but it's almost on purpose. They also do not run to exile, because we don't want to give them the ability to expunge their crazy act by just running away and then living happily ever after in that other city, and therefore they're not allowed to go to exile, and God is going to do the accounting with that person, and on top of it, the relative is allowed to kill him. Okay, the relative is allowed to retaliate. So, because the refuge cities are able to accept certain types of people, certain level of convicts, not a certain level of murderers, not everyone. Now, let's talk for a few seconds about refuge cities. There were actually 6 main refuge cities, 3 in the land of Israel proper on the left side of the Jordan, and 3 on the east side of the Jordan. It's also the land of Israel, but it belongs to the 2.5 tribes. And then there were an additional 42 cities, so a total of 48 cities. 42 cities that also have some level of refuge. So we will see someone can go and start over there and then go somewhere else. I mean, there are different levels of how much refuge cities those 42 cities are giving. It's a lesser refuge. The facilities are less comfortable there than in the main 6 cities. Okay. Now, how long does the refuge, the refugee has to stay, the murderer has to stay in a refuge city? So the law is that they have to stay until the Kohen Gadol dies. The Kohen Gadol that lived when he entered the refuge city, when he dies, then the person is getting off. And we will see why and what's the connection. We will see. We will learn about that. Now, Goel Adam, that's the relative. Goel Adam. So the relative it needs to be a relative that can inherit the person. So if the deceased is a father, the children, the sons, are the Goel Adam. Because they're have the right to inherit the father, they're the ones that can go and retaliate. You don't say that, a second cousin once removed is, or any relative, can pick up arm and do it. It's a specific type of, and there is a real disagreement whether the Goel Adam, the children, are obligated to go and retaliate, or they're just allowed to go and retaliate, and we'll talk about that as well. We're over the time, so we actually start chapter 2 next time, next week.